What is he on about, man? Don't put the pants on.
This is a tutorial on how to have perfect form. Everybody in the gym usually comes and stands around and watches me every single time I do these. I'm about to showcase the most prominent, most best form that you should be doing in pull-ups. Here we go. Come on. This is a tutorial on how to have perfect form.
私はとても幸せねあなたの愛に包まれとるから私はとても幸せよあなたの愛に包まれとるから今夜は私はなさねえで夜が明けるまで Do you remember the song? 私
How to become a pro at making sprue goo. First off, get your sprues in the jar. And don't squeeze your acetone too hard, it flicks everywhere. Also, hold back from weeing in the jar. And make sure that you handle your sprue with a utensil rather than grabbing it straight away, because that is some sticky stuff. Oh, I think I made an error there.
2, 1, range. 2, 1, mage. 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 2, 1, range. 2, 1, mage.
In this video, I'm going to show you how you could improve your dry brushing. Hello everyone, and welcome to another brushstroke painting guide. I'm Brushstroke, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the painting technique of dry brushing. So what it is, how it works, what disadvantages it might have, and then some ways to maybe overcome them. And then to finish off, take a look at some suggestions as where you can fit dry brushing into your painting process. So let's dive straight in and answer that first one. What is dry brushing? Well, put simply, it is a technique of painting which uses a brush with a very little amount of paint on it to bring out detail and texture on a surface. But rather than me try and describe it, maybe it's just easier if I just show you. So for this initial example, I'm going to use this wonderful base from Generation Shift, and what I've done is I've primed it in a black primer to start with, and as you can see there's lots of lovely detail and texture on there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you by using dry brushing how you can bring out all of that lovely detail and highlight all of that texture really simply and really quickly. And to do this I'm going to use a dry brush. We'll talk a bit more about brushes later, but this particular one is a large dry brush from Artist Opus. And then for paint, because I want to really exaggerate the contrast between the primer and the colour going on, to really show what's happening, I'm going to use a pale grey, and for this I'm going to use some Administratum Grey from Games Workshop. And all I'm going to do, having given this paint a good shake, is just take the paint directly from the pot, load a little bit up into my bristles here, just making sure that I've got a decent amount to work with. Something like that should be fine. And now I'm just going to grab some paper towel, just going to fold that up and put that down there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my loaded brush and I'm going to rub that back and forth on the paper towel, which is going to remove the majority of the paint out of the bristles and leave me with just a small amount. Now this might sound quite wasteful, but trust me, this is how the process works. So all I'm looking to do is remove most of the paint so there's the smallest amount left in the bristles. So I'm just going to test that on the back of my hand, because as I rub it on the hand, what I'm looking to get is just the smallest amount coming out, so it's just a very light dusting. I think I need to take a little bit more off, so I'm just going to very quickly just brush that against the paper towel a little bit more, just take a little bit more paint out of it and then just test that again. So as I'm rubbing that now, I think that looks about right. As you can see, there's very little coming off now as I'm rubbing it back and forth against my hand, and that's exactly how you want it to be. So to start off with, as with all painting techniques, control comes from stability, and if you've seen my edge highlighting video, you'll know that that's achieved by having your hands in contact with each other as you paint. In this case, I like to just use my little finger and then rest that against my hand or the model that I'm painting, which then leaves me free to be able to flick the dry brush back and forth in this kind of rocking motion. So with my little finger in contact, I'm now just going to very lightly start to brush my brush back and forth across the surface of the base in a rocking or flicking motion. And the key thing here is pressure, so I'm applying very little pressure. In fact, I'm barely touching the surface at all with each pass of my brush. And as that very light contact is made, a very small amount of paint is left on the surface of the base. And as you can see, as I continue to lightly brush my brush over the surface of the base, paint is starting to build up on all of those raised details and edges, but not in the recesses or gaps. Almost like magic, all the details are starting to be painted in and highlighted. There's no camera trickery here, it really is this simple. It's like painting on easy mode. With no real effort on my part, I'm able to apply paint to all of the details on the base and produce a lovely highlighting effect. And because of how simple this technique is, it is often one of the first techniques beginner painters will learn on their painting journey, and rightly so. However, this has meant that dry brushing is often perceived as a beginner's technique and looked down on as not real painting. This of course is complete nonsense, and I want to use this video to show that dry brushing is an incredible technique and one every painter should have in their skill set, because with practice it can produce some amazing results. Easy to learn, difficult to master. So as with everything in painting, practice is key. Okay, so as you can see, this effect is starting to really build up on the base now, and I'm just doing exactly the same process over and over again, just lightly touching the surface with my bristles. As the paint starts to run out in your brush, you might need to start adding a little bit more pressure just to get the same results, but that's fine, you can adapt that and change as you go. I'm going to leave this running in real time just so you can get a feel for how long this process actually took for this particular face. Okay, so what was that? A couple of minutes, maybe 3 minutes max. I've gone from a completely black primed base to a lovely light grey highlighted base with all of the edges highlighted and nice soft highlights on all the flat surfaces, all the raised areas nicely painted in, and for little to no effort on my part whatsoever. How cool's that? Right, okay, so that's what dry brushing is, and as you can see, it's really simple to do. But how does it work? So as you just saw from that really quick example, dry brushing is really simple to do, and essentially it just breaks down to needing just 3 key things. Firstly, a lightly loaded, almost completely empty brush of paint, so it almost feels dry to the touch, which I'm presuming is where the name of this technique comes from, because you're basically painting with a dry brush. Secondly, applying the paint using a fast flicking motion of the brush. And lastly, using a very light pressure so that the brush barely touches the surface. To illustrate this, let's imagine this shape is the surface of our base or model, and as you saw, by taking a brush lightly loaded with paint and brushing it gently against the surface with a rocking, flicking motion, it slowly deposits a small amount of paint onto the surface. And it's that combination of lightly loaded brush and low pressure that results in only the topmost parts of the surface being caught by the brush. Unlike conventional painting techniques where the brush is more heavily loaded, resulting in a larger amount of paint to be deposited on each stroke, dry brushing deposits only a small amount of paint for each stroke, meaning it takes multiple passes to build up any coverage. But this is a good thing because it gives you control over the process and allows you to choose how much coverage you want. So if you want a light, subtle effect, then just a few light strokes is needed. If you want a stronger, starker effect, then simply do more passes and build up more paint. You can also vary the results by altering the pressure you use on each stroke. By increasing the pressure, more of the surface will be caught by the bristles on each stroke, resulting in a greater surface area being affected and receiving the paint. I often refer to this difference of pressure in my videos. For example, I might say to apply a light dry brush, meaning that I only want to use a very light pressure because I want to focus on just the topmost details and edges to achieve a highlighting effect. And then at other times I might say apply a heavy dry brush, meaning to use more pressure so that more of the surface area is painted to achieve a layering effect where the recesses and lowest details are unaffected, but the majority of the surface will receive some paint coverage. So as we saw with the previous base example, dry brushing is a great way to pick out and paint the texture of a surface. But did you also notice that I often change the orientation?
Two, one, mage. Two, one, range. 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 Two, one, mage. 2, 1, range. Two, one, mage. Two, one, range. Two, one, mage. Two, one, range. Two, one, mage. Two, one, range.
Of the base as I was brushing the surface. That is because it's also important that you work with the texture to get the best result. So what does that mean? So let's suppose that our miniature has a surface which has a series of ridges, like fur perhaps. Dry brushing would be a perfect way to highlight the very tips of those ridges, but in order to do this it's better to brush across the texture like this, rather than trying to brush along the texture like this. Because brushing this way, you're more likely to find the brush will follow those ridges and run deeper than you want it to, meaning the result will be that you'll end up painting much more of the ridge and actually down into the recess as well. Especially if you're using a flat style brush like the one in this diagram, as the shape tends to want to follow the grooves more while you're brushing along the grooves like this. Which neatly brings us onto the topic of brush types. So for dry brushing, you can pretty much use any brush you like. But do bear in mind, dry brushing is very hard wearing on the brush due to the abrasive action of the technique. So many people like to use old brushes which have long since lost their point and are not great for normal painting anymore. But you can also buy dry brushes specifically for dry brushing, and they come in a range of different sizes and shapes, interestingly enough. And I've got a few of the most common ones here. So for example, there's the flat edged brush like I've been showing you in my diagrams. But you can also get ones that have angles to their bristles as well, like this one in the middle. And then finally on the end, I've got the sort of curved or domed bristle versions, like the one I used to paint in the base at the start of this video. So let's take a look at each of those different shapes and see what difference they make when dry brushing. So let's take our textured shape again and use it to compare how the different shape brushes behave during dry brushing these simple steps. Starting with the flat bristled brush, if I were to flick this brush across the stepped texture using the back and forth motion and a light pressure, its contact with the surface changes at different points of the sweep of the stroke. The steps in the middle of each stroke receive more paint compared to those at the end of the stroke. If we were to do the same with the angled bristled brush, we see that its contact points for each stroke are different, with its shape resulting in more paint being applied to the top of the steps and less to the sides. And finally, if we do the same with the curved or dome bristled brush, we see that the contact with the surface is more consistent across the whole of the stroke, making for a more even distribution of paint across all of the points of contact. Okay, so this illustration is obviously quite simplified, but it is intended to show that the different brush shapes make contact with the surface differently, and that difference makes for a different application of paint from the brush. Now with this knowledge, it enables you to make a more informed choice as to which brush will suit you better. The angled bristle shape is often great for if you want to have more paint in a certain direction, for example highlighting from a certain light source. However, it then means that you would need to be very consistent with your brushstroke direction in order to achieve a consistent result. The angled bristle brushes are also very handy if you're having to try and dry brush into a tight gap. By having a point, it means that you can reach into areas where other shapes perhaps couldn't. As for the difference between flat and curved brushes, I would say that they can both achieve the same results, but the curved shape is much more forgiving and predictable as its shape mirrors the motion of the brushstroke, making it have more even contact with the surface. Whereas with the flat brush, you need to be more conscious of both direction and pressure in order to achieve a consistent surface contact with each of your strokes. Overall then, I would say the shape of choice would be the curved bristle brush, especially for beginners as it's a lot more user-friendly, easier to learn with, and you'll get much more consistent results. By the way, if you're interested in the specific Artist Opus brushes that I use, then you can find out all the details about them by clicking the link above. So we've looked at the basic techniques of dry brushing and the brushes to use, but what about the paints? Can any paints be dry brushed with? So the answer is the majority of model acrylic paints can be used for dry brushing. For example, I have a number of paints from the GW Citadel range here, where the base, layer, edge paints are all absolutely fine to dry brush with. Paints which are not suitable, however, are washes, glazes, the new style of contrast and speed paints. The reason being they are simply too liquid to work correctly as a dry brush paint. By the time that you've removed all the moisture enough to be able to make them dry brush, there's not enough pigment and content left to actually work. But what about specific paints that are made for dry brushing, like GW's dry paints? They must be the best paints to use, right? After all, they've been made just for dry brushing. Well, in a word, no. And here's why. The paint itself is essentially a standard acrylic paint with a significant amount of moisture removed from it. So now it's more of a form of a squishy goo. The idea being that you can simply load your brush from the pot, and because it's so much drier, you have far less to remove on any paper, but it just doesn't work. The paint you end up with in your bristles doesn't brush on smoothly and very rarely produces a nice consistent finish. In my opinion, you're far better off buying a regular paint, which you can use for dry brushing, airbrushing, hand brushing, rather than a dry paint, which is only made for one thing and not very good at that. So, which paints to use? It's a no to dry brush paints, no to washes, glazes, contrast, speed paints, and yes to all the bits in the middle. Okay, so we've covered the basics of what dry...
Two, one, mage. Two, one, range. Two, one, mage. Two, one, range. Two, one, mage. Two, one, range.